young women now, and you could probably speak to some of this from your own experience, but I know, talking to my son's friends more generally, there's a really strong script for young women now. It's a very different script to the one their mums had. Their mums or grandmothers it was, you're going to be a wife and you're going to be a mother. Maybe if you work, it will be part time, but that's your primary role. The new script for women is get educated, become economically independent, become empowered, and make sure you can stand on your own 2 feet. It's a really positive, powerful script for young women now. It's and wonderful in my view. But what's the script for men now? We've torn up the old male script for good reason. What's the new male script? Where's the sense of ambition and where are the messages we're sending to our boys about their education and their independence, their empowerment? And the answer is we're not. And so then they end up drifting, and it's not their fault; it's our fault.
It is my pleasure to have joining me on Forward, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, the author of the incredible and important new book Of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. Richard Reeves. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you for having me on, Andrew. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. Congratulations for taking on this important topic. So Brookings, just to level set for everyone, Brookings is generally considered the number one think tank in all the land. And you are a wonk, an economist. Like, what was your work in prior to examining what's happening with boys and men?
Yeah, I think I have to correct you already, Andrew. I think it's number one in the world. Unless by
Sorry
right,
about that.
right, just like the Brookings Com people are going to kill me if I don't correct you. It's like the global number one think tank. And interesting, when I moved to the US from the UK in 2012, I'd served in the government over there. My wife said to me, where would you most like to work? Like, where's the dream job for you? And I said, scholar at the Brookings Institution. And I'm really fortunate that that is exactly where I landed. And that's because the Brookings Institution is non-partisan, it's authoritative. Our values are quality, independence, and impact, which means that we can do our work without looking over one shoulder or the other, worrying about which senators are going to call you. Just do the best you can. And my work previously is focused mostly on economic inequality and lack of upward mobility. What are the barriers to people being upwardly mobile? And that was true in the UK and now in the US. And that gets into issues of class differences in the US, obviously race differences in the US. But that then led me to this new focus on boys and men, because as I was doing that work, I just kept stumbling across these inequalities that actually were troubling and which didn't go the way you'd expect to go. When you talk about gender equality, you presume you're always talking about women and girls. Sometimes you still are, but increasingly we now have to look at the problems facing boys and men. And so that my work on inequality and family and class led me to the new focus on boys and men.
So you open the book with the fact that some people tried to warn you off this topic, I
Yeah,
suppose.
yeah.
But then you end the book saying that everyone actually is interested in the topic, which made it feel like there's this undercurrent, but people hadn't publicly spoken about it and kind of were afraid to.
Yeah, one of the reasons I ended up tackling the subject was because so many of the people that I was talking to, this was the issue, right? The school gates, over the dinner table, over at lunch break, people were talking about their sons, they were talking about their brothers, their uncles, and just how they were struggling either in school or in the labor market. But particularly if they were on the center left, that wasn't something they took out into public. That was something that would remain private. So they felt like there was this gap between a lot of the private anxiety people are feeling, including among many liberals, and the public discourse around this issue. And so it was almost like it was the inequality that dare not speak its name, at least
Yeah.
on the center left. And so it was into that space that I really felt I was trying to some extent, bridge the gap between the schoolgate conversations and the political conversations, where there's really been a deafening silence, especially on the center left, and then a weaponization on the right, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, so let's get this out of the way really quick. I wrote a book, The War on Normal People, that delved into some of the issues that are facing men, particularly as their most common livelihoods have been automated or globalized away. And it's not a zero sum game where you can be concerned about boys and men and still be very much for elevating women in areas that they've been discriminated against in or marginalized, or generally advocating for gender equality. The argument you make is that, look, gender equality is gender equality in the sense that if there are realms that one gender is really really falling behind in, for example, boys in school, that also is gender equality, and it's a very legitimate thing for us to be concerned about and try to address.
Yeah, that's right. And credit to you, Andrew, and also you were kind enough to endorse this book. But your Washington Post piece, I think, was an important intervention. And you've obviously had Warren Farrell on here before and talked to him. And so I think you are one of the few public figures who have been willing to engage in this issue in good faith, and what I would say is a positive way, which does avoid exactly that zero sum framing you've just described, which is this: if we're presented with this choice, like, whose side are you on, effectively, right? And that even raising the fact that there are some areas where boys and men are struggling means that you have to stop paying attention to the areas where women and girls are struggling is just it's a nonsensical false choice. A classic example of culture war paralysis. And actually, my wife, for example, is trying to raise money right now for a startup. And you will know some of these stories, Andrew. But so I know on a very personal basis that only 2% of venture capital money goes to female founders. Right, I'm reminded of that on at least a daily basis, and it's true, and it's a problem. And then there are other areas we could talk about where there remain problems and barriers facing women and girls. It doesn't mean we have to then ignore the problems facing boys and men. It's a false choice, and it turns out people can think two thoughts at once. Our politicians struggle to do that, but ordinary people are perfectly capable of doing that.
Yeah, and it's a symptom of our polarized environment where it's like choose a side, and then
Hmm.
you wind up in this inflamed environment. When I was running for president, I became very acutely aware of the issues facing boys and men. And one story that did come across my desk from Warren Farrell was that there was another Democratic presidential candidate who said, I can't talk about this because I'm in a Democratic primary.
Right.
And that's obviously in my mind perverse and messed up. So let's dig into the problems that you identify. So broadly speaking, it's school and it's work, and you have some prescriptions for each. So let's start with school. Boys are struggling at school from the get-go, essentially K through 12. The stats are staggering. I will confess that I am a dad of two boys. Mine are much younger than yours. It sounds like
Mm.
yours are in their early 20s.
Yeah.
Mine are 9 and 7. But the data around boys struggling in school and being immature and their brains forming later jives with the experience of just about every parent and family I know. Where if you have girls of the same age interacting with your boys, you're like, wow, these girls seem like 100 times more with it than my boys, and you don't you don't like necessarily impugn your boys by saying that. I mean, like that, like a lot of folks are having very similar experiences, but unfortunately, that's playing out in schools writ large.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting example of how it took the women's movement. It took progress on behalf of girls and women to expose some of these differences. And so, as you say, there are these big gaps. So, a few data points that you know well, but in college, for example, the college gap is huge now. The the percentage difference between the women getting 4-year college degrees and men is now 15 percentage points in favor of women. And that compares to a 13 percentage point gap in favor of men in 1972 when Title IX was passed to help women and girls. Among those with the highest GPA finishing high school, two-thirds are girls. And among those with the lowest GPA, two-thirds are boys. In the average school district in the US now, girls are almost a grade level ahead in English and have matched the boys in math. So there is sometimes this idea, well, girls are better at some things, boys are better at other things. Well, basically now that's not true. Basically, just girls are better at everything. And that great catching up and overtaking has exposed the ways in which the education system actually doesn't suit boys very well, and particularly for the reasons that you've identified. And again, I had 3 boys, raised them through adulthood, and it is just a fact that the parts of their brain do develop a little bit later on average than girls. And it is the bit of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, that is the bit that says finish your homework, don't go out partying. Oh, and also turn in your homework the next day. Oh, and also maybe study for that test because that test will affect your GPA, right? And your GPA matters for your college admissions, and getting into college might matter for your future. So it's about future orientation. And there's a difference between boys and girls, and it's one of those things where I've got all this evidence from neuroscience and all the psychologists, and then you share all that with teachers and parents and principals, and they go, well, duh. Like, this basic fact is not surprising to them, but we ignore it in our education policy. Like, why, if that fact is so obvious to everybody, do we ignore it in the way that we structure and time education for boys and girls?
Yeah, so you have a number of recommendations, 3 big ones, which I all agree with, frankly. Number one is the most interesting, and I think has gotten the most publicity, which is redshirt the boys. Let's just have boys start school a year later. The other two, just so people have a sense of it, it is to invest in vocational education. And the third was, jog my memory.
More male teachers.
More
We
male
have fewer.
teachers.
We have. And
Yes.
this is just in education. Those are the 3 big education ones. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what has the response been to redshirting boys for a year, which I think is a great idea? I've advocated for a gap year
Mm,
as an example, heading to college, because the maturation serves
mm.
people really well.
Yeah, that is an alternative that people have proposed, including in the UK. There's been this debate about should you have this gap year, especially for boys. But my view is that we should just start earlier. Right? If we know that gap is coming, if we know that developmental gap is coming, and it's particularly wide in adolescence, why don't we just anticipate it, right? So start the boys early.
Your idea is better than doing the gap year later, because a lot of the data shows that the boys are struggling earlier on, and you want them
Yeah,
to actually have a foundation, enjoy learning, not have behavioral problems,
yeah,
etc.
yeah. I mean, my view is that rather than letting them fall behind and then try and catch up later, why don't we try and help them keep up? Right? It's easier to keep up than to catch up. And so I think if we start them in school a year later, it means that just developmentally they'll be closer to equal. Right? So one of these weird things, like the chronological age that we choose to start kids in school, is very arbitrary. It's a proxy for development, but it turns out that it differs on average between girls and boys. And so let's actually just bake it in from the beginning. I think it's one of those suggestions that sounds incredibly radical to a lot of people, except every parent and educator and principal I've spoken to, right? So they all go, yeah, of course you should do that. Like, to them, it's blindingly obvious. But of course, it would need to be piloted and evaluated. But that's the one. I think that's interesting. That's got some more pushback. Interesting, the others, in theory, the idea that we should spend more on vocational learning, and the fact that we should at least try and arrest the decline in the number of male teachers in our classroom. Most people are like, they're on board with both of those ideas. The red shirting one is a little bit more controversial, I would say, and there are good arguments against the policy as well as in favor of it, which I try to take seriously in the book. But overall, what I'm being pleased by is when people are disagreeing, what they're saying is, I don't think that's the best way to help boys. Okay, right, let's have a discussion then about the best way to help boys. But at least we're having the conversation now about boys, which means we've accepted the fact that they might need more help.
And now a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. Here at Forward, we like to focus on solutions, not problems. But the fact is, sometimes our brain itself doesn't want to get into problem solving mode. It gets stuck. It focuses on the negative and not the positive. And sometimes your friends and family really aren't equipped to help you into a better frame of mind. When you're in that state, you should really think about therapy. I saw a counselor when I was a teenager and have been a huge believer in therapy ever since. And if you're thinking of giving therapy a try, BetterHelp is a great option. It's convenient, accessible, affordable, and entirely online. And you can get matched with a therapist after filling out a brief survey, and then switch therapists at any time. When you want to be a better problem solver, therapy can get you there. Visit betterhelp.com/yang today to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/yang. Give it a try. What's the downside? Now, it's one reason why your work is so valuable, Richard, is that you're an unimpeachable resource. Like it's hard for people to dismiss you out of hand, the way in this environment, unfortunately, like a lot of folks who stand up and say, hey, there are a lot of struggling boys and men out there. You can be marginalized as a crank or like
Yeah.
a neocon of some kind or a culture warrior yourself, where the data is very clear. I mean, like the struggles are very, very real. Now, one of the things you just said is that 57% of college students are now women. I think it might even be 59 or 60% in the
It's
most
about
recent
it's
class.
about 60% now. Yeah.
So having a 3-to-2 female to male ratio means that there's going to be a very, very tilted dating market on college campuses, and then it's going to actually persist when you graduate from college. So this is something you didn't talk so much about. I mentioned it in my book,
Mm.
which is that college educated women essentially do not marry non-college educated men for a whole host of reasons. And so you wind up with a lot of mismatch in the dating market. And this is obviously assuming people are heterosexual. I mean, there are a lot of homosexuals. So, that like this doesn't apply to the entire cohort, but it largely applies. So you wind up with a whole host of college educated women who effectively don't have mates.
Hmm.
And you also have a host of college educated men who essentially have been primed to be jerks because
Yeah.
because what one of like the empirical findings is that if men have advantages in the dating market, their behavior towards women gets worse. And then the reverse is true, that if women have their pick of guys, then the guys all behave a lot better, or at least the guys who have a chance in the dating market behave a lot better.
Yeah.
This was something that I'm sure you noted because you did a ton of research for this book.
Mm.
But it was something that I think people don't realize is an outgrowth of the mismatch on college campuses. People can look at the 60-40 women men, say, hey, that's a little bit messed up. But it actually has profound downstream effects.
Well, it might. One of the reasons why I don't address it is because I'm less convinced than you are at this point that it is going to be an issue for dating, and I'll say a bit about why. I mean, I think the first thing is, like, it's very interesting if you talk to admissions officers and they're now on the record about this. If you go past 60-40 in terms of your female male ratio, it starts to affect admissions. It turns out that actually it becomes less attractive both for men and women to go to a very female dominated campus. And so there's a lot of people they're desperately trying to keep their gender ratio closer to at least closer to 60. And that might well be because of just how it feels to be on campus, right? And assuming that, of course, heterosexual dating, that it affects for sure it's affected dating on college campuses. No question about that. Whether it will roll forward into the labor market, we just don't know yet. It's a bit early to tell. We did just pass a historic moment, which is that now there are, in most marriages now, the woman is more educated than the man. And obviously, we're going to see an increasing, that trend line is going to increase. The big question is, are women with college degrees really going to prove reluctant to marry a guy without a college degree? Right? Historically, we haven't had to answer that question because of the historic imbalance. We're now starting to ask it. I'm a bit less pessimistic than some are. I think that I don't think they're going to want to marry someone who's economically disadvantaged as well. But I think it's perfectly possible to imagine a world where you have a woman who's a nurse, say, so she clearly has a degree in nursing. And I have friends in this situation. Is she going to marry a guy who's got his own plumbing business and is making good money? or is she going to say no, he has to have a 4-year college degree? I, I don't think so. So I'm not as worried about it yet. And then the final thing that makes me more optimistic is that college educated women and college educated men, but they're really keen to make sure their kids do well. And one of the reasons they'll marry is because obviously two earnings are better than one. They are convinced that fathers and mothers are both important. And so the drive to marriage among the college educated, the marriage rates are very high among college educated Americans, really high. I think that's largely because of parenting, and I don't think that's going to go away. So what's happening is people are projecting forward this difference in colleges into the dating market, and I think prematurely panicking. Ask me again in 10, 15 years whether my optimism is misplaced, but that's for me not really the main reason to be worried about this. I think it's because it's tough to be in the labour market without a good college degree. I will say one thing, I haven't thought about this before, Andrew, but you just mentioned, by saying heterosexual, of course, does raise an intriguing possibility. The single biggest cause of the rise in LGBTQ identification is the rise in the number of young women describing themselves as bisexual. So you could speculate that if, to the extent that that's the case, well, maybe what you're going to see is a rise in the number of same-sex relationships as college-educated women pair up with other college-educated women rather than having to trade down. I have no empirical data to support that, but it's an intriguing possibility.
So the other two solutions that you argue for, it was interesting that male teachers do improve results for male students, and female students show no difference. So it seems like male teachers is an empirical win, and I hope that we do try to get more men into classrooms. And vocational schools seem to help male students, and less so female students, but that is not a reason to not invest in them. Helping male
Right.
students is a major major win at this
Well,
point.
if they're the ones struggling, it comes back to what you said a moment ago, which is like if you just approach this like in a fairly boring way, which is, here's a group that seem to be struggling. Here's a policy that seems to help them. Unlike free college, by the way, which doesn't seem to really move the needle for male college going. Actually, technical and vocational training is a rare example of an intervention where the benefit does really seem to accrue more to boys and men than to women and girls. And you could see that as a bug, but I see it as a feature. Given the current trends facing boys, like why is that a bad thing? And so one of my proposals is to create 1,000 new technical high schools. There's about 1,500 now, and even with like pretty big assumptions about federal funding, you could probably create 1,000 high schools for about $5 billion a year with some federal subsidies. That would double the number of students who can go to a technical high school, and $5 billion is 1% of what the college loan forgiveness program would cost conservatively, right? So
Wow.
so for one
Yeah,
for one
seriously.
1% of the cost of forgiving college loans, we could create 1,000 new technical high schools, and that would take up the number of students in them to about 15%. And the biggest beneficiaries would be boys, and especially boys from working class backgrounds. And so that kind of policy should be on the table. And the fact that it disproportionately helps boys should not be seen as a reason to not do it. It should be as a reason to do it, as well as doing a bunch of stuff to help women and girls. Again, back to where we were before, like we can think two thoughts at once and we can do two things at once.
Now, one of the most interesting findings in your book was that a host of policy interventions don't seem to work.
Yeah,
Like if you just mentioned free
yeah,
college,
yeah,
and it turns out that a bunch of girls in Kalamazoo took full advantage of that, but boys did not.
yeah.
And there were other programs that had the same result, whether it was tutoring or retraining or whatever the heck it was. That it seems like when you try and help a population uh, broadly, the girls and women are in position to take advantage, but for whatever reason, boys and men, it just doesn't seem to click or work.
Yeah, I think that's partly because like it's within mainstream education that a lot of these interventions are tried, but and it's not much discussed. It's well known among the people whose job it is to evaluate these interventions, but it tends to be in like the final paragraph, and people will say, oh, we should do more work on this, but it's not really discussed much. And the free college one is the one that really first caught my eye. So Kalamazoo has a free college. Every kid that graduates from high school in Kalamazoo gets full tuition paid pretty much any college in the state. It's very generous, but more importantly, it's the only free college program that's had a really high quality evaluation longitudinally by a bunch of scholars from Upjohn. And as you just indicated, actually increased the college completion rates for women by 50%, which is a massive impact. And it increased the college completion rates for men by zero. Like, literally didn't move the needle overall for men, which is an extraordinary finding. Like, making college completely free. And so I think that speaks to, first of all, look, the guys are struggling in education generally. And so just solving the financial aspect of it doesn't solve the educational problems. But I also think it speaks a bit to motivation and incentives. Young women now, and you could probably speak to some of this from your own experience, but I know, talking to my son's friends more generally, there's a really strong script for young women now. It's a very different script to the one their mums had. Their mums or grandmothers you're going to be a wife and you're going to be a mother. Maybe if you work, it will be part-time, but that's your primary role. A new script for women is get educated, become economically independent, become empowered, and make sure you can stand on your own 2 feet. It's a really positive, powerful script for young women now. It's fantastic and wonderful in my view. But what's the script for men now? We've torn up the old male script for good reason. What's the new male script? Where's the sense of ambition, and where are the messages we're sending to our boys about their education and their independence, their empowerment? And the answer is we're not. And so then they end up drifting, and it's not their fault; it's our fault.
We all want to lead happier, healthier, more productive lives. One of the ways to do that is to make sure that you're getting the sleep you need. And one of the best ways to get the sleep you deserve is to have a high quality mattress from Helix Sleep. The Helix lineup includes 14 unique mattresses customized to you. You take a sleep quiz and find out your perfect mattress in under 2 minutes, and then they will send it to you where you have a 100-night risk-free trial. That's right. You can sleep on that thing for 3 months and then send it back, but I'm pretty sure you're not going to want to send anything back because the Helix sleep mattress is the hit mattress in my entire house. People fight over it every night. We have death matches around who's going to get that mattress. We don't do that, but I gotta say, it is the number one mattress in our house and the number one mattress picked by GQ and Wired magazine. So there are a lot of people that love Helix Sleep, and Helix is offering up to $200 off all mattress orders and 2 free pillows for our listeners. Go to helixsleep.com/yang. With Helix, better sleep starts now. And this goes into your analysis of both a left and right approach to the struggles of boys and men. And you very interestingly characterize, correctly in my view, that the left tends to assign accountability to systems for the failures of groups, with the exception of boys and men. Where when, like, if a boy or man screws up, then it's because they were individually noxious or badly behaved. And your argument, which I think is correct, is look, like, if you're going to apply that framework, it should apply to boys and men too, and that this is not just a cascade of individual failures, that they're actually structural issues that if you were serious about trying to build, an equitable society, you should be thinking about these issues the same way.
Yeah, it's a rare. This is an instance of agreement between left and right, although in different ways. They do basically individualize the problem, and as you say, on the left, that's pretty rare. Typically, the left will point to structural barriers, structural problems. But in the case of boys and men, it can be the result of toxic masculinity, or there'll be stereotypes about, well, they just want to watch, they don't want to look at porn and play video games and smoke weed. They're just losers. Men are trash. Hashtag men are trash, etc. You even saw that in COVID, and men were dying in much higher numbers of COVID. That was blamed on them, and completely unfairly.
Or this pejorative term incels, involuntary
Mm.
celibate, and Bill Maher made a joke which I could relate to, certainly as like a nerdy Asian kid, is that like we all start out as involuntarily celibate. You know?
Right.
Because, and the somewhat fortunate among us maybe, like end up having some opportunities, or be able to gain confidence in a particular arena. But then if you don't, then you can get stuck very easily. And you point out the international phenomenon of kind of the shut-in men of Japan, of which there are hundreds of thousands. And there it's a documented phenomenon. But in the US, it's kind of maligned as like, oh, you're like these incels. And instead of being a sympathetic figure, you're a malignant figure.
Mm.
Now, the danger, of course, is that if you have a real problem, and you say this in your book, and I think this is very, very important, is like, look, if you have a real problem and responsible people don't try and help it, then irresponsible people will just go right in and say, hey, okay, you're upset, you're marginalized, here's why. And then they'll drag you down some conspiracy theory internet rabbit hole, and radicalize you. And we have many, many young men who are now unfortunately receptive to that because they're at home and angry.
Yeah, and I think to that extent, the manosphere, as it's sometimes referred to, which is a sort of conglomeration of so-called incels, men going their own way, pickup artists. There's this guy Andrew Tate, who's he's been banned on lots of platforms, but incredible viral videos, which are just sort of this incredible misogyny, funny in some cases and so on. But I think that's our fault. We, as in like mainstream institutions, etc., have created that market. And of course, if you create that market, then someone's going to supply it. We've created it by not discussing these issues, not confronting them, not actually acknowledging, oh yeah, here are some issues facing boys and men, and here's a bunch of things we're doing to address them. And so what that means is that when the irresponsible people say, no one cares about you, right? No one cares, right? So here's a young man, right? You're struggling in the dating market, maybe you're struggling at school, you're struggling to find your way in the world. And then someone comes along and says, that's because the left hate you, it's because the mainstream media hate you, the elite just think you're toxic. There's enough plausibility to that claim to drag that young man deeper and deeper into the manosphere, because he does look around and he doesn't see responsible people addressing his problems. And to the extent that they're addressed at all, it is to blame him. It is to say there's something wrong with you. You're toxic or irresponsible. And there's all these stereotypes. And one of the results of that is greater isolation for young men, etc. But rather than pointing the finger, we should be offering a helping hand. And in different ways, both left and
Yes,
right, they're,
amen.
they're pointing fingers there. And actually, but it's particularly frustrating for those on the left to do it, who actually, as you indicated, make a point of not doing that in other circumstances and saying, look, what's happening here? What are the structures around you? Are the institutions serving you well? What's the script you're following? How are we supporting you as a society? How are we empowering and affirming you as a society, right? And then tackling all of those things correctly for people of color or LGBTQ or whatever. But we've got to do it for young boys and men too. The default assumption that we don't is just wrong. If we neglect them and neglect the issue, we have created the circumstances in which men might shut in, check out, or at worst, get pulled into some pretty dark places. And so that, I think it's incredibly important that we take responsibility. We have a cultural responsibility to address this issue.
Yeah, I totally agree. So we've gone through school. Uh, on the work side, you and I both note that we've lost a lot of manufacturing jobs,
Mm.
and those jobs were 70% male. Similarly, transportation jobs and construction and installation jobs, also predominantly male. And some of these roles are either being automated or globalized away. You had globalization at, I think, 2 million jobs. Just one objective fact is that we have 4 million fewer manufacturing jobs in the United States than we did at an earlier point in time. And so, if 70% of those workers were men, then you have a whole lot of men who now don't have those jobs. And their next step has been unclear in a lot of communities. There's this work imbalance. And yet, at the same time, some of the most visible fields, whether it's finance or tech, or law or consulting, continue to be male dominated. And so there's this bifurcation going on that falls largely along educational lines. It falls along regional lines. It falls in different industries, and the net effect has been that there are many, many men who are on the outside looking in because of a transforming economy, but their struggles have not actually been highlighted or brought to the fore.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it speaks to. And obviously, you've done a lot of work in this space, and you have your own policy ideas about how to respond to this shock. Right? I think it is a shock, and I think you've talked about it in that way. Like this is the labor market has just the automation in particular, and to some extent free trade, just massive shocks to the economy, which we're not responding to. We're just whatever you think the solutions to that are, whether it's UBI or whether it's some of the proposals I've got in here, like the fact that we need to respond, I think is the most important fact. And you're quite right that what's happened is that both of those shocks have disproportionately affected men, especially working class men, and the adaptation that's required to flourish in the new economy has been one that many men have struggled with. And I also think it's one of those we haven't really worked on. Women are moving more quickly into some of the newer jobs. They were already in jobs that were more protected from automation and trade in some of the more hands-on type jobs. So they were less affected anyway. But actually helping men to move into and retrain for the new jobs is absolutely right. And here I think is where the right actually are quite irresponsible, because to the extent that they do engage with the issues of boys and men, it's typically to then imagine that they can wave a magic wand and bring back the jobs of the past. So Senator Josh Hawley gave a big speech about men, and at the end of it, he said, we'll have a tax break for marriage, which is bonkers and doesn't work, and we're going to bring back manufacturing. Like, well, where's your magic wand, Senator?
Turn back the
Yeah,
clock.
no problem.
We have a time machine, Richard.
No problem.
Let's just
I mean,
move it
and
backwards.
it's incredibly irresponsible, because what it does is it sends a signal that vote for me and I can bring back the world as it used to be, which of course you can't. These trends continued under Donald Trump, right? There is no president who can jawbone the economy of the 50s back into existence. But what it sells is it sells this false prospectus of I can a rear view mirror politics, rather than saying, okay, here are some real problems, here's how we're going to help you address them. And so to the extent that the right does, even they acknowledge the problems of boys and men, but they typically to either blame feminists, blame women, blame modernity, etc., and then say, don't worry, we'll bring back the 50s, which nobody wants. Even if we wanted it, we can't go back in the time, unless you've got that time machine behind you somewhere that you can send it to Senator Josh Hawley, which he doesn't want, by the way. I mean, his own wife is an incredibly successful professional. Nobody, even the most conservative person, doesn't want a world of complete gender equality, and really doesn't want to turn back the clock on manufacturing either, I think, even if they knew how to.
So the marriage rate among non-college educated Americans has plummeted to below 50%, which I think is a very crucial threshold. Where now a majority of Americans don't expect to get married. Maybe they expect to get married, but they won't get married. And this winds up having some very negative effects on the next generation. You have a lot of data on boys and girls growing up without dads. It turns out that dads are a plus. As a dad, I felt pretty good about that. And more people recognize that having a dad present is incredibly important for all sorts of positive outcomes for kids. And you have a number of recommendations in that direction around trying to establish fatherhood as a different type of relationship than a purely economic relationship, which is the way it's codified right now in a lot of circumstances.
Yeah, so I agree. You pointed there's this huge class gap in marriage, which we kind of alluded to earlier. It's really interesting. And that in and of itself is an important data point, that it is the most economically powerful women, arguably in the history of the world, i.e. college-educated American women, who are marrying and staying married at the highest rates, which is not what Gloria Steinem or anybody else predicted. Even Gloria Steinem just got married. Right, that's an interesting moment in and of itself. Meanwhile, as you point out, that for less educated Americans, it's actually much more common to not get married, and certainly not to have children inside marriage. So the non-marital birth rate among non-college educated Americans, as you say, is now above 50%. Now, if we assume that fathers matter, and then it turns out, as you just alluded to, there's good evidence that fathers matter. Interestingly, especially, there's really good evidence they matter to teens, especially. Like, so you're coming up to this point, Andrew, like you've mattered all along, but you're going to matter even more over the next few years.
It's my time to
Yes,
shine coming up,
it's like,
Richard.
here comes Andrew, because it just, for whatever reason, dads matter throughout childhood, but I sometimes fear the way we talk about kids is that we think it's game over at the age of 5, right? And we ignore the huge importance of adolescence, which is actually looks like dads might have some sort of special powers when it comes to adolescence.
Well, I certainly had no special powers when it came to infants.
Right. Well, your
So-
special power might be is to just be there doing your bit. But so fathers matter, involved fathers matter. So and what we see is this real rise in fatherlessness. In other words, the kids who don't see their father. So within 6 years of their parents separating, a third of American kids never see their father,
yeah, it's
and
crazy.
another
Terrible.
third see him once a month or less. And so what happens as the relationship between the parents breaks down, or perhaps didn't exist in the first place, the relationship that gets destroyed is the one between the father and the kids. And if the father's not a breadwinner in particular, he basically gets benched, right? So if we continue to see the role of the father as this married breadwinner, and increasingly men are neither of those, certainly not that sole breadwinner anymore. I mean, women are the breadwinner in more than 40%, main breadwinner in more than 40% of households. So what we do is we end up benching the dads. And so what a lot of social conservatives would say is that's why we need to bring back marriage, right? The way to tie men to children is through marriage, right? We need to restore marriage. Well, A, I don't know how we're going to do that. B, I think that's the genie's out of the bottle on that. And so what I think we need to do instead is build fatherhood up as an independent social institution. Fatherhood needs to be put back on a pedestal, just a different kind of pedestal. And we need to say to dads and communicate through policy to dads, and I have some ideas on that, that you matter as a dad, period. Not just as a breadwinner. We all too often treat fathers as walking ATMs, particularly in our child support system, and forget about the relationship between the fathers and children. And that not only matters even if the father's not living with the kid, but especially if they're not. I found one really interesting study that found that kids whose parents are separated, but they have a strong relationship with their father and spend a lot of time with their father, actually do better than households where the father is present, but they never see them and they have a very distant relationship.
Yeah, that was a compelling study. I was like,
Yeah,
wow, a good dad outside that home who actually shows
yeah.
up and
It's
cares is better than the present dad who is
yeah.
totally checked
So
out.
and that
Like that was because I actually thought having a dad in the house was like an intrinsic win, but that
Well,
study
well,
kind of showed that
look, I think it is to the extent that if the dad's in the house, it's obviously easier for him to have a closer relationship, right? So I wouldn't deny it makes it easier, but what it exposes is that what's really going on here is it's the relationship. And so this idea of absent, present, and absent father can't just be described by is he living with the mother or not, right? Actually, my first marriage ended in divorce, so I have a child from my first marriage, and I was an incredibly involved father with my eldest child, very, very strongly in his life. It took a lot, but of course it was harder. It took a lot of work. And I think the problem is
yeah.
if we continue to say must be married, must be living with the mum, when that's just not the case for so many now. In fact, it's only the minority of American kids now who will grow up throughout their childhood with both biological parents. And so, look,
Yeah,
this
that was
is the
crazy
world
too.
as it is. And again, having made these massive changes to family structure, I don't think we can just sort of turn back the clock. And in the meantime, we're just leaving too many kids without a strong enough relationship with their fathers. So equal paid leave for mothers and fathers, and a really radical reform of our child support system that really has not kept pace with the changes in families in the US.
Now, one of the major changes you champion is that the same way philanthropists and elected officials get excited about women in STEM, we should get excited about men in
Mm.
heal. Men can heal, where heal stands for healthcare, education, administration, and literacy. And you make this really, really striking comparison that there are more jet fighter pilots who are women at this point on a percentage basis than there are kindergarten teachers that are
Hmm.
men.
Many more.
And, yeah, and that male teacher pays off in various ways, and so we want to try and make it so that men can go into the classroom, the hospital, other environments that are considered right now sort of the domain of women, I suppose, in part because these sectors, one, need men, but two, these industries are much less subject to automation. They're much more resilient. They have much more sustainable long term prospects.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you frame this argument. Like, what's the most compelling way to argue for the need for more men in these professions, the healed professions as opposed to STEM? It's worth saying that even as we've increased the number of women in STEM, with further to go for sure, we've at least tripled the number of women. I think it's up to 27, 28% of women in STEM now, up from like 7 or 8%. The share of men in those healed professions actually dropped. And so fewer K-12 teachers are men. Only 24% of K-12 teachers are men now, down from 33% in the early 80s. Only 1 in 10 elementary school teachers. And you're quite right, as a share of the profession, there are at least twice as many women flying US military jets as there are men teaching kindergarten. And I actually think that from a social welfare perspective, it's more important to have men in kindergarten classes than it is to have women flying fighter jets. I mean, I'd like as many women flying fighter jets as we can get. But interesting, we're redesigning the cockpits of our military planes to be more inclusive, so that people, particularly of different heights, can. So, which would actually help short men as well, by the way. Because it was excluding so many women. But I don't see us really redesigning or spending much time to try and get more men into our classrooms. And so there's just an asymmetry here. And I started off thinking, look, the main reason to get more men into those jobs is because of employment prospects for them. And I still think that's true for the reasons you just said. But I think actually, in some ways, the more compelling argument is because we want the people using those services, whether they're healthcare, education, counseling, social care, to have the option of having a carer of the same sex. It's been really striking to me how many people have like, yeah, I try and choose a school where there are more male teachers. That's what we did. My dad is in a care home, and when he needs to go to the bathroom, he actually prefers a guy to help him, but there are no guys. And one of the ones that's really, really troubling me, given the mental health problems that we have in this country and that you've talked quite a lot about, is the drop in the number of male psychologists. So if you go back just to 1980, psychology was roughly 50-50. It's now 29% male, having dropped from 39% just in the last decade. And among psychologists under the age of 30, only 5% are male. So if
Whoa.
you roll that forward, and if you think it's important to have counselors and psychologists, mental health professionals of both sexes, and I think it is, I think it's important, right? When I went to a therapist, the issues I was dealing with, it was definitely better that I was with a man. And when some of my own sons have had issues and have had to seek some mental health support, definitely better with a man. Now, that's not going to be true for everybody, but pretty soon that's going to be really hard to find. And so I think that just from the point of view of like caring, these caring professions are caring for men and women, boys and girls. And so it would be good if we had men in those roles. Like in schools, for example, most school
Yes.
counselors are women, most special needs teachers are women. But most of the people referred to special needs are men. Most substance abuse counselors are women. Most of the people referred to substance abuse counseling are men. And so there's these real disparities between the provider and the user of those services. And so I think that that's a really good reason why we should be throwing money at this. Here's the controversial bit. I think we should have male-only scholarships to get men into some of these professions. We should have subsidies for employers that are diversifying their workforce by hiring more men, just as we've done to get more women into STEM. We should be willing to invest money and time and political capital getting men into these healed jobs.
It's so important that you are trying to champion these measures that I think are necessary in order for us to address the structural problems. It's already happening at the college level, and you referred to it that colleges are trying to keep men above 40%, and there is some putting of thumbs on the scales. by the way, like there's some data that shows that if they all of a sudden like aren't allowed to tweak, then the percentage of men
Mhm.
drops. Like there were a couple of
Yeah.
studies or a couple of schools maybe that said, okay, you're not allowed to consider it. Then all of a sudden, so we're already doing it softly. We're doing it quietly. And in many ways, what your work is allowing us to do is just to face
Hmm.
facts. Be like, okay, guys, look, if we want more guys in the classroom, probably going to have to spend some money on it. We want more guy psychologists, going to have to spend some money on it. Want some tech and apprenticeship and vocational and apprenticeship schools that are going to help men. We should probably spend the money on it. And men need it in uh, various
Mm.
contexts. One of the chapters you wrote that was a tough one to read was the situation for Black men. And when you hear the word intersectionality, right, like the things that come to my mind are not Black men right now. It's used to talk about how racism and sexism intersect, sometimes sexual orientation as well. But you make a compelling case that Black men are really being subject to a
Mm.
double whammy, and that it's going to be impossible for us to make meaningful progress writ large on something like closing racial disparities without specific measures targeting Black men.
Pretty much every gender gap we've already talked about is just amplified when it comes to black men and women. So there's already 2 college degrees going to black women for every one going to black men. The wages of black men have barely moved in the last few decades. White women, meanwhile, have blown right past them. So for every dollar earned by a white woman, a black man earns 84 cents, which is about the same as the gender pay gap between men and women. And so that's a classic example of intersectional analysis, because what you're looking at there is and race and gender. And of course, black women earn a little bit less than black men, although the gender gap is much, much smaller in terms of earnings. And actually, there are more black women in the workforce than men. Already, black women are the breadwinner in most black households, the main breadwinner in most black households, partly because of some of the family trends that you discussed earlier. But I think that like the way intersectionality is applied and how it ought to be applied is what you're getting at there, because there is a sense that intersectionality is just like a game of stack it up, right? So you just keep adding stack, 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 and you get X points for being female, X points, whatever, and it's just cumulative. But properly applied, which I don't think many of the intersectional theorists do, and even Kimberly Crenshaw herself, who coined the term and works, I don't think she applies her own theory to its fullest extent, because what it means is that you should look at the specific circumstances of different groups and see how their gender, say, or their race plays out. And when it comes to Black Americans, for me, the evidence is pretty clear that on most measures, Black men are worse off than Black women, and not despite being men, but very often because they're men. They face all kinds of bias, all kinds of exclusion. Obviously, they face the highest incarceration risks, particularly during the war on drugs and the war on crime. In education, they are basically the ones who are struggling the most. Whereas black women are actually doing pretty well. Upwards mobility, black men are the least upwardly mobile groups. This is back to some of my earlier work. Black women are one of the most upwardly mobile groups out of the bottom quintile. But then, of course, in terms of households, they often struggle. So, in fact, the struggles of black men affect black women, don't get me wrong. But I think that's intersectionality at its best. And what it means is that we can contemplate the fact that black men might be actually suffering as a result of being male rather than benefiting from being male. That may not be true for Asian men or white men, or at least nothing like the same extent. Then you could add class, then you could add geography. But what I think that it means is that we just have to look at specific groups. And if we're serious about looking at groups who are struggling, and we don't take seriously the particular situation of black men and boys, then I don't think we're being serious at all.
Yeah, you mentioned this White House Commission on Gender Inequality, and it's all about issues that are facing women, despite this relatively benign name that seems like it would address any form of inequality. And I think maybe your most important contribution is to expand gender inequality to apply to boys and men in certain contexts. which is not the way a
Right.
lot of people use it. I mean, the way a lot of people use it is that, hey, we have to help women and girls, which, by the
Yeah.
way, I'm for in
Where we
environments
still
that.
need it. So we can think two thoughts at once. Right. To be fair, so what happened was that the Council on Women and Girls was abolished by Donald Trump, and then rather than recreating that, they created the Council on Gender Policy Council, which actually did seem to open the door to looking at gender inequalities that run the other way. Many of which we've discussed, but that didn't happen. So there's the first national strategy on gender equality has been published, and it doesn't contain a single gender inequality that runs against men and boys. So it is completely asymmetric. I think that's both wrong empirically for the reasons that we've been discussing, but I also think it's just a massively missed political opportunity. Like even just have a few areas where you say, well, look, here is a place where actually boys and men are on the wrong side of the inequality, and here's what we're going to do about that, would really have blunted the attack I think the centre left face, which is that they don't care about boys and men. Like the way to blunt that attack is to show that you care about boys and men. And the Gender Policy Council was a real opportunity to do that. And thus far, it's been a completely missed opportunity, in my view.
You talk about the dysfunctional approaches on both sides, where the progressive side wants to ignore anything that runs afoul of a narrative that's that men are advantaged, and then conservatives are just trying to turn back the clock and don't have any productive policy solutions. And a lot of it hinges upon how much you see the role of biology, like whether there are intrinsic differences between boys and girls. And you make, I think, the very reasonable argument that yes, there are genuine biological differences between boys and girls related to risk and um, testosterone and aggression, and uh, sex, but they're not all-consuming
Right.
dispositive. Like that they can be addressed and moderated by culture, and that there is not necessarily the word toxic in front of the word masculinity.
Right.
Like in every case, like there has to be a definition of masculinity that is positive. And I think that's what most people want. It's one of the major problems, in my view, of the current polarized environment, is that, again, you can't hold two thoughts in your head. Like, you can say that, look, boys and girls are different, but it's not that we need to accept every difference as carved in stone, and that there are things that you can do in terms of structure, institutions, policy, culture, etc.
Yeah, I think you put it exactly right, which is that there's a fear, I think, particularly among progressives and the centre left, that even acknowledging any differences in biology, just you've given up the farm, right? If you give an inch, they'll take a mile. And to be understanding of that view, it's because historically, of course, but discussions of biological difference have been used as arguments against women. They have been used to justify sexist policies. And so I understand the concern, but I also think that it ends up being self-defeating to deny any differences at all, because anybody that's like been in the world realizes that's not true. Certainly, anyone that's raised kids, or been a kid, or seen a kid,
Which should be
right?
all of us,
That's
yes.
most people, in my view. Knows there are these differences. The question is, how much weight do you put on them? How much do they matter, etc. And so you get so the left, and they play off each other. So the more the left denies any differences in biology, the more the right emphasizes that they are everything, right? That everything's binary, and by God, we're completely different, and that's why women should stay at home and look after the kids, and men should be president and commander in chief and stuff. And so it's incredibly boring, tiresome kind of discussion, because the truth is that, of course, it's both nature and nurture. And more importantly, recognizing that there are some natural differences, and you just highlighted some of them, doesn't in any way mean culture's less important. It means it's more important, because culture is one of the ways that we learn how to express or not to express these natural differences, how to bring out the good side of some of those traits whilst acknowledging and dampening the bad sides of those traits. So culture is how you grow up. And so the acknowledgement of nature makes it even more important to take culture more seriously. And so let's take one of your examples, like risk taking. On average, boys and men are a bit more risk taking. They're more willing and able to take risks. Is that a good or a bad thing? Neither. Sometimes it's good because men are willing to put their lives on the line. They're more willing to die to save the life of a stranger. Is that a good thing? Yeah, I think that's a pretty good thing. But is it good when they're a teenager and they do as one of our friends' kids did and climb up a 8-story crane and then send a Snapchat saying, "Hey, hi, mom." No, not good. Or some of the ways in which men take bad risks with their health. That's bad. Is it good or bad in business that men are a bit more risk taking? Well, it's good in the sense that sometimes those risks pay off, but it's bad in that it creates instability. And so what we do as a society is we take these differences that overlap or on average, acknowledge them, and then try to bring out the best in us, whether that's masculine or feminine, whilst perhaps trying to manage down the worst. And honestly, every human society ever has been engaged in that cultural task. And I think it's incredibly arrogant of us to think that we somehow don't have to do that. And we don't have to think about what a pro-social masculinity looks like, because every other human society has tried to do it. And now we have to do it in a way that's not only compatible with gender equality, but supportive of gender equality. That's what most people want. Most people don't want to wash away the differences. They just don't want the differences to become excuses for inequality.
Yeah, pro-social masculinity indeed. And one thing you said in the book, which I agree with, is like, look, you can't ask men not to be men. You just have to try and define masculinity in a way that is positive for them and women and society writ
Yeah, and
large.
that's what's being lost in the current debate, I think, because on the one hand, there's a sense of masculinity is intrinsically bad, right? And no one, to my knowledge, has come up with a satisfactory definition of non-toxic masculinity that is distinct from femininity. They just can't do it. And so it becomes a slur, honestly, to say toxic masculinity. It doesn't help to create what I think is important, which is mature masculinity. And actually, I think what we're seeing now is a celebration, particularly on the right, of an immature form of masculinity. I think Donald Trump was like an avatar, and I
Yeah,
kept
it's true.
thinking, like, who does Donald Trump remind me of? And then I realized it was my 16-year-old sons and my 16-year-old self. There was a sort of
Wow.
middle finger, transgressive, boorish, kind of just like uncivilized, and actually, it's to our great shame that that's appealing to some people, because it's so transgressive.
Well, I think of him as the crazy uncle, but the 16-year-old works too. You know?
Yeah, well, you're right, but it does to some extent. It's like the men who don't grow up, right? We need grown-up men as well as grown-up women, and we don't get that by calling them toxic or rolling our eyes at them or caricaturing them or stereotyping them. We get that by taking seriously the institutions in our society that help us all to mature and become better human beings in the end is what we're after. And to the extent that we are different as male and female, well, let's acknowledge that without turning it into some sort of, as you say, dispositive characteristic.
Richard, I am so happy that you wrote this book and that you're making this case. What has excited you or invigorated you about the reaction to it? What has the reaction been? I'm going to say you are the most significant think tank intellectual figure to point out these facts. Your stature is such that the New York Times and others are reckoning with the argument. I think you might have the chance to mainstream the fact that boys and men are struggling and that it's a thing that we should be trying to address in a way that perhaps no one else has had that opportunity. How have people been reacting to your work?
Well, first of all, thank you for saying that, Andrew. Not only because it's a huge compliment, but also because it does speak to really one of the motivations for the book. There's a book is about creating content. Here's all these ideas, here's these facts, here's these studies I've read. But honestly, I also think it's very often about creating space. And one of my hopes and goals for the book has been to create a bigger space within which we can have this conversation, and to some extent, a safer space within which to have this conversation, because it can't be dismissed as, hopefully, can't be dismissed as the frothy ravings of some, men's right fringy person. At least not yet. Let's ask me back in a few months. But so far,
Let's not give them any ideas, Richard.
but so far that's right. And you're right. To some extent, I have a bit of insulation coming out of the gate around that. I've been incredibly pleased by the way in which I've had engagement from left and right. but I've probably been most pleased by the substantive nature of the disagreements from the left. What has not happened is that just it has not just been dismissed as just like we don't have to engage with this. And so you've mentioned the Times, but David Brooks had a column in the Times that sort of praised the book very well and said he doesn't talk about culture enough. But Michelle Goldberg had a piece in the Times that said actually that essentially said good social democracy would solve a lot of these problems, and they spend far too much time on culture and not enough on redistribution. But what was striking about that, she said, look, everyone knows there's a problem here.
Really?
Right? It's not like, well, so okay. I mean, honestly, that's a huge moment. That's a huge win. And so the argument I'm having so far with people is about whether or not I've got the right solutions, whether I frame it in the right way. But no one's really tried to claim this is just made up, misogynistic nonsense. And so that in and of itself, I think, is a really interesting sign. My own view is that there's a real appetite for a proper conversation about this that hasn't been on offer, certainly from mainstream politics, but that actually ordinary people of all classes, all races, are actually really open to this conversation, so long as it's had in a good faith way. Get our facts straight. We can argue about the solutions, but it's time to get serious about this. And I'm sensing so far the response, yeah. And,
Past
and
time.
again, Andrew, you've written about this yourself, and so I think you yourself have helped to create the conditions in which this book can land. But I'm really pleased with the seriousness of the engagement, especially with the disagreements, because if we're seriously disagreeing about what to do about this, that's huge progress.
Has anyone suggested a policy or solution where they said, hey, I don't like your red shirt idea. Instead, we should do this or that? Like, has anyone actually suggested something where you're like, yeah, that's a good idea?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that gets suggested a lot in education is single-sex schooling. But actually, I looked at that and I just don't find very strong evidence that it makes. That doesn't really seem to
Interesting.
move the needle very much, and it's obviously a much more radical reform than redshirting. I mean, sending boys to the same schools, like, it's pretty doable,
Redshirting is pretty doable. You
you
just freaking,
just do it.
as a parent, I could
Yeah,
have chilled with the kids for another year, or like just like found an
yeah.
environment. I mean, like that there are pre-Ks now. You just have them there for an extra
It's
year.
it's tractable, but actually one interesting idea that someone had is that they suggested that like there's these huge gaps in high school GPA by gender. Of course, high school GPA is becoming more important in terms of college admissions as colleges go test optional. So boys and girls are basically they're dead level now in SAT and ACT. But girls are way ahead in GPA. And on most other measures of high school performance. And so actually GPA is becoming more important. But someone said to me that actually that ninth grade is where boys really seem to struggle. And I've yet to sort of really nail down the data on this. But they said that's where you see a big gap opening up. So how about just ignoring ninth grade and just doing high school GPA based on the grades after that when boys are apparently doing a little bit better? And having had kids who managed to get I don't know if I should say this out loud, but managed to get sub 2 GPAs in their freshman year at high school. Right, it's hard to recover your high school GPA from that, right? I have at least 2 out of 3 sons who would have done much better if we'd called ninth grade a wash. Just said let's ignore ninth grade. That's an interesting little idea.
I I am I am
All
for
right.
this. I am for both. Let's redshirt them and let's just X out ninth grade from GPAs. Like, you're too raw. You're running away from the
Yeah.
seniors. Who the heck knows?
And also, let's try some of these things and then evaluate them. I mean, like you're a wonk too at heart, I think, Andrew. And so I think let's pilot some of these ideas and then see what seems to work. There's some stuff like technical high schools where the evidence is already pretty good. I think it's good. It's good enough. So there's some things where if President Biden called me after this and said, okay, I'm gonna redshirt every boy in the US, I'd say, hold on, let's just pilot it first. Let's just see. But if he called me up and said, okay, I'm going to spend $5 billion to create more technical high schools, I'd say go for it.
You'd be like, heck yes, let's go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I do think like the evidence for some of it, we have to be clear that in some cases we just haven't done enough of it to get good enough evidence. And because redshirting hasn't really been pursued as a deliberate policy, we would need to do a bit more evaluation. But technical high schools, apprenticeships, paid leave for dads, the evidence is in. right? Those I would be like, yes, Mr. President, let's go for it. You know, who knows? My phone might ring right now, Andrew, and it could be President Biden saying, I read your.
I hope so. I mean, shoot, man, if I were our president, you'd all of this stuff would be happening. That's for sure.
Mm,
Men in Heal, I think the data is also
yes,
very very clear. My work, Richard, is so that your work actually becomes the dominant discourse and approach to things. Because right now, that what makes me so sad is that you have this inchoate polarization, and people like, know this, know that, and meanwhile, like, our families are suffering. And you said it in your book. You said, look, parents are just worried about our kids. Americans are worried about their families, and then our leaders are stuck in these partisan positions and roles that have less and less to do with what the heck is happening on the ground, and what's going to be good for us and our communities. So my work in life right now is to try and improve the political environment to a point where the policies you're fighting for become the law of the land, in fact, and common sense. It's like there's so many things where, you're pointing out all these things that are happening to boys and men. I mean, they've been creeping up and rising for years and years. I mean, what Michelle Goldberg said about a social democracy that was healthy would have been addressing these things is totally right. So just kudos to you for an incredibly important contribution. I hope everyone picks up of Boys and Men, why the modern male is struggling, why it matters, and what to do about it. And Richard, anything that we can do to help you with your work, please do let us know, because I see this message and your now mainstreaming this set of concerns as one of the most important things going on in American life.
thank you very much for having me on, Andrew, and thank you for those words. I really appreciate it.